All right. All right. Welcome to our brief series of lectures on logic for the course. As I mentioned before, we're not going to spend an awful lot of time on this um, as a subject itself, other than uh, one that introduces the different breeds of logic that you'll encounter in the course, as well as the some of the more common fallacies. Right? Which uh, on occasion will be in might be in some of these philosophical arguments, but that's going to be a very rare thing. The inclusion of these fallacies is more for the sake of mindful things to be mindful in your own writing and your own argumentation. Um, so logic, right? Broadly speaking, there are only two real branches of logic, um, and there are multiple variations of both, but two branches broadly speaking. Uh, think of it like a tree that's been struck by lightning but managed to survive at the roots and still grows out, but now in two different directions. Right? They share the same base, but they wind up being completely divergent, separate beings overall. Right? That base being that they're both forms of logic and they're both concerned with distinguishing between correct and incorrect reasoning, but in vastly different ways. So, the first branch, and the one that you're going to encounter most often in this course, is called deductive logic. Right? And deductive logic, by definition, is a process of reasoning from one principle to another by means of accepted rules of inference. Right? What this means is that it's formulaic. Deductive reasoning is basically mathematical in nature. So, when you form an argument using deductive logic, so long as you're applying the principles correctly, right, uh, then as long as your premises are true, right, the basis of your argument are true, then the conclusion should also be true, or at least it should be logically sound. Right? So it just follows logically, step by step, like a flowchart or, a mathematical equation, right? If you were doing a proof in algebra, right? It's the same sort of logic involved. So if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true by default, so long as you use the valid forms and rules of inference, right? Uh, and it's concerned primarily with validity of the argument, right? Is it a valid argument? Not necessarily its soundness, but its validity, right? A good deductive argument should be both valid and sound because that just makes it a good argument overall. But deductive logic itself is just concerned with validity, right? Which is how you can get some absurd sounding arguments uh, that are still valid, right? So a couple different forms of deductive logic, right, um, that you'll encounter to some degree in this course are the reductio ad absurdum, right, is the first one. So that's reductio ad absurdum. And what this means, it's Latin, and it literally translates to reduce to absurdity, right? This is functionally a proof by contradiction, where you take as one of your premises uh, some conclusion or some conclusion or the premise that you want to some conclusion you want to show to be false, right? So basically you take your opponent's conclusion, put it in the framework of your own argument, right, and show how logically, just based off of various definitions uh, and whatnot, you can that their own conclusion is absurd because it leads to a contradiction if you just follow along logically with the shared premises between you and your opponent, and as a result, it since it leads to a contradiction, this means that your version, right, or the conclusion you're trying to prove is true. And you come to this proof by essentially contradicting your opponent's conclusion, right, showing that it leads to contradiction. And functionally reducing it to their argument to absurdity. There is also modal logic, which is a branch of deductive logic concerned with necessity, possibility, and impossibility, right? So it's a special form of deductive logic that is the focal point of ontologists, right? Those who use ontology. And it was developed uh, in large part by the philosopher Saul Kripke in the mid 1900s, right? So less than 70 years ago, I think, is when he really developed it. And we'll see some arguments be put into modal form to help you kind of digest what exactly the point is that's being driven at with them. All right. Now, the other branch of logic, right? The other discipline is called inductive logic, not as compared to deductive logic. So it's logic by induction, right? And inductive logic is concerned with probability, right? Since we're dealing with probability, the truth of or the truth of the premises does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. We're working towards the most likely explanation given the evidence, right? So inductive logic is evidentially based reason. This is the sort of reasoning you see in science, and you also do see it in philosophy too. Traditionally, however, most philosophical arguments have been framed in terms of deductive logic, right? It's only within past couple hundred years that we've gotten more and more inductive logical arguments, right? So the use of deductive logic is what has allowed for vast philosophical frameworks, like full world views, to be put forth through philosophy, right? Inductive logic is used like in more specific domains, right? To create philosophical or to gear ourselves towards philosophical conclusions that are more probable because their basis has to be informed by science or math or something of the like.